Frankie,
Ian,
what up, dude?
what's up, man? How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I am the timing is good for you because today we are talking about the parallels of fantasy football and the real world implications in business. And Frank, you just happen to be leading our fantasy football league for like the first time in forever, maybe like 6 years. You're so
First
lucky.
time ever, Ian. And yeah, there
Very
we go.
proud of you. Very proud of you. The whole league is proud of you. There's a buzz. There's a buzz around Frank and his team. It's a special team he's put together this year. Very special. He's just
CBS really had.
decisions, waivers. You are destroying it this year. You're in that magical zone. You're having a run.
Yeah, it's nice. And CBS still thinks I'm the fourth rated coach in a league of four. And my draft was rated a D minus.
Yeah, I love it. I love it that they have you as the underdog every week, and you're leading the league in points. It's outrageous.
Oh, their algorithm really needs to be updated.
I mean, it's probably a big reason why you're winning is the I got to imagine you're using that in the locker room before your games, just like no one believes in us. No one believes in us except us. Let's rally.
My wife loves when I talk to my imaginary friends.
So Frank and I are in a fantasy football league with only 4 people. It is a very different league than most, and it's largely for 40-something-year-old dudes that just want an excuse to go on a trip a couple times a year. And what's funny is the 4 of us only talk 4 months out of the year. The other 8 months, we just literally go radio silent. No one hears from anyone for 8 months, and then we talk during our league. But Frank and I got to talking about how similar fantasy football is to actually managing a business and the areas where it is completely dissimilar. But I think on either side, it would be we could take both sides of the episode, but we thought it would be a fun episode to really go through and think about what would business look like if every manager led their team the exact same way they run their fantasy football team. And so that is what our topic of the day of this podcast is going to be. And obviously Frank is going to have the last word on every topic because he is leading our fantasy football league. He is the victor so far.
So let's have a little fun with this, right? Like, let's give a little bit of context first. So it's a high dollar league. It's not a bunch of dudes at $100. And instead of it being 12 or 14 or 16 players like there are in most leagues, there are just 4 of us, like that, as Ian mentioned. Now, what we've done is we figured out this is our 5th season doing this, and there's usually a boondoggle or 2. We're in the middle of a pandemic. I have a 2-year-old. I have a pregnant wife. This goes into sales, this goes into planning and organizing, and this goes into never leaving a bro behind. So this year we were doing, who doesn't want to go there? We went to Detroit, Michigan. We need to
second Detroit trip.
Second trip to Detroit. We need to see Big Gretch. We had to go see for ourselves what was really happening in Detroit. And one of our buddies, his name is Nilo, one of Ian's high school, like grade school friends, one of Ian's fraternity brothers, and me. So I'm the outsider. I've been in the group the least amount of time. But we went fishing in the Detroit River, which who doesn't want to fish in the Detroit River? In addition to that,
God's country.
I flew in. I was emailing Ian from the plane, and Ian goes, "Frankie, are you in Detroit?" And I go, "Yeah." He just starts laughing. He goes, "What the fuck are you doing in Detroit? We don't arrive until tomorrow." I'm like, no way. What are you talking about? You're screwing me. He goes, "Yeah, I can't even be cold-hearted here. Like, I can't even play a joke on you. Like, that's even past me," he says. He goes, "There's no way I'd have you fly there a day early." So do you want to talk a little bit about like how
there's a pause? There's a pause in the text thread. And then Frank calls me. Clearly he scrolled down the text thread to see if he got the wrong or if I screwed something up, and it was 100% on Frank. But he's like, "Well, I'm in Detroit." So we didn't get in till the next day. So Frank got to spend a dreary, overcast day hanging out in the city of Detroit.
Which was great about this. So what's happened in Ian and mine's friendship now is this: like, if one of us screws something up, we're like, well, that should probably be a podcast. Like, it's basically the biggest FU that the other one could give. Like, Frankie, your lack of organization. We'll probably need to talk about that in the podcast.
Bring it up in a podcast. Maybe some of our listeners would have some tips for you.
So who can relate to this? So we discussed the fact that I'm there a day early. Like, it dawns on me that I'm a dumbass. I screwed up. Holy crap. So I got all these other things happening later in the week, and I realized, well, I can't get home until a day later than I thought. But the biggest moment of like regret is I've got to call my wife. Like, I've got to tell my wife that I screwed up. Something that I could absolutely do on the internet and not leave my house. I've flown to Detroit and I've screwed up so bad. I'll be back a day later.
Yep. So now I'm spending one more day in Michigan that we've already fought about because I have a baby on the way and a 2-year-old at home that's creating havoc. So now I'm spending twice the amount of time in Michigan for a draft that I could have done in 30 minutes on my cell phone.
Sales, baby. It's a podcast, so you will have to talk about it.
That's good persuasion. And I'm sure I can only imagine the chips you had to throw into the pile on that negotiation, what you had to give up to make that work.
No doubt. Never leave a bro behind. All right, Ian, let's talk about fantasy football and business.
So the first thing we're going to talk about, Frank, is the absurd amount of research that goes in to choosing someone to be on your team. And I think this goes in the pros bucket. This goes in the pros bucket of if business was run like fantasy football, how would it look different? And I think the interviewing, recruiting, hiring process would look totally different if it was comparable to fantasy football. So there's 4 of us. One guy pretty much buys a magazine on the way out to the draft and does very little research, and that's Paxson. And Paxson is never even close to being in the running. He jokes as this is annual friendship tax that he has to pay us because he's never won $1 in this.
His team usually looks like the team you should have drafted 5 years earlier. He has all the players that if you had them 5 years ago, wow, you would have kicked everyone's ass.
Yes, he's very dated on his information. But the rest of us, we put some time in. Anyone who's ever been a fantasy manager, you do mock drafts, you buy magazines, you read every preseason report you can get your hands on.
I print off reams and reams of paper from ESPN and ESPN Plus and CBS, and you're highlighting stuff. You're doing all kinds of crazy things before the draft.
Custom spreadsheets where you're moving guys up and down based on your preferences. You're studying the last 3 years of stats production. You're looking up, how do second-year receivers make jumps typically? You're trying to project out. It's how many hours do you say you put into just the stupid draft that you go into it?
Probably somewhere between, like on a bad year, like 3 or 4, but on a big year, like, upwards of 10.
Upwards of 10, maybe more than that, right? Maybe more than that because you really start looking in kind of a month out.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of soft costs that we're not factoring.
A lot of soft costs. It could be upwards of 20 hours to prepare for a fantasy draft that you're going into. And most people are in more than one. I'm in more than one fantasy league. My son's in one now. So I'm kind of preparing for all of them. But I know an absurd amount of information about the 3rd string wide receiver for the New York Jets. I know a lot of information about the backup running back for the Jacksonville Jaguars that I should not know, that I certainly did not know when I was a 10-year-old that was just a fan of the Detroit Lions.
Correct.
You spend a lot of time and you take it very serious. All the way, our draft has, 26 rounds because of how many players we have?
Yeah.
26 round, we are taking that pick serious, and we know a lot about the guy we are grabbing in the 26th round, which is the 100th person picked in our round. And some leagues have 12, 14 teams. And those rounds, when you get into the 16th, 17th, you still know about the guy, the obscure running back or kicker that you are picking, and what I would say is the average fantasy owner, the average person that's in a fantasy league, whether it's just for fun or a big money league like we are, like Frank was talking about, spends a lot more time evaluating the people they put on their team than the average manager does who makes a hire into an organization.
So Ian, I want to talk about that a little bit, right? So like your experience coming from NVR and GE before it, there's HR departments, and we can get into that in a second. In my business, I've been in business over 11 years. And in my business, I finally have gotten to a place where I have a headhunting department. I have staff, like I have an assistant and I have a headhunting department. And I was just getting a coffee a minute ago before we started this. And the headhunter is back there. He's like, man, that podcast is great. I'm like, oh, that was just us shooting the shit. But he can hear the whole thing. He can probably hear me now. Hey, Vinny. So he's back there. But this is what's cool is if you get to a place in business, you're going to have tests and you're going to have resumes and you're going to have all kinds of other things. And that stuff just literally shows up in my calendar. And when I walk into an interview, it's printed and I will spend minutes in prep, minutes where Ian's talking about, and that's for a career. And what Ian's talking about is hours. Now it's different because I take someone who's being hired very seriously and there's a rigorous process to get there. But if I was to spend 2, 3, 4 hours researching that person, looking them up on Facebook, doing all types of other stuff, I would know more about them. Now, I have gotten to a point in my business where someone's doing that. Someone's checking your LinkedIn channel to make sure you don't post crazy stuff. That if you work, but these are the little things that I think we're trying to draw the parallels to. Like we know absurd amounts of things about, Channing, or what's the Crowder guy's name, who's a receiver for the Jets, but
Channing Crowder,
you got to make sure. If you're not physically doing it for employees, someone needs to, and someone needs to be doing that level of research because you can get hurt otherwise as a business owner.
I think what Frank's not talking about, though, whether he puts the time in or not, someone in his organization they take a funnel because the world
That's
is
right.
your population of opportunity of people you could hire. So there are 7 billion people in the world that I could hire at any given time. Obviously, I need to be able to shrink that down to a funnel. By the time it's got to Frank, that funnel is shrunk down to one resume in front of him. But what he's not talking about is a recruiter that did a phone interview, a recruiter that went and Googled that person, went to their LinkedIn page, went and showed them how to go to the online application and fill out a full application. He didn't talk about the test that he made that person go through so that he had test data to compare against other people that have successfully or unsuccessfully performed at Cava companies. He didn't talk about all the hours that went into that resume dropping on Frank's desk. And Frank knows that by the time that funnel, not anyone's going to land on Frank's desk. He has coached the people before him of what does a candidate need to have on their background? What kind of a person am I looking to hire? He has coached those people. So Frank has spent hours coaching people that work for him on this resume shouldn't be on my desk unless it meets this kind of criteria. Get to know the kind of person I would hire and don't put them on my desk unless that's the case. And so there is an entire organization that is whittling that down to the point where it's pretty simple. And in fantasy football, there are rankings and there are lots of different ideas and things go in. So if you don't want to put a lot of time in, someone else has. You can do okay in a draft if all you do is pick the next available person in a ranking from a big organization. And that's kind of what Frank has built is by the time it gets to him, there's a good chance it's going to be someone that Frank would hire. Now, it doesn't mean he will, but a lot of that work has been put in.
We're joking here because if you're interviewing with my company, I take my employees' careers way more serious than I take our bullshit draft. But what Ian is saying is, I will continue to dominate our fantasy league if I can staff it as well as I've been able to staff my company. And I won't draft idiots within the 14th round because we put a system in place. That's the reason we get incredible candidates. Not only that, now if you go to ESPN, you go to CBS, you go to any of these other places that are fantasy kind of hotbeds where you can get info, they go through a metric. They go through all these different things. And they have rankings. They literally, you can find anything ranked from beginning to end. What we do in our company, Ian, a salesperson, what would you guess how many tests a salesperson takes?
What, to get into your company?
Just to get an interview.
One. I don't know. One.
5. We have them take 5 separate tests. And we do it through a process. We don't make you take all 5 right up front. Like we put 2 hurdles in front of you immediately. It's on our job. It's in our ad. Like if you don't, if you're in sales, we have a test that's specifically built for this, where if you're not that type of a person, sales is not the right job for you. It doesn't mean we won't hire you in a different role, but we know very, very early, you got to hit these two things. If you get through those two tests, we put you through a third
What do you
test.
mean by tests though? I don't understand that. Actual tests?
Yeah. So the first thing we do is what's called a predictive index. Predictive index is one of 16 different types of personalities that you have. I'm a captain. My guess is you're probably a captain or something along the, or I'm a strategist. My guess is you're a captain or a strategist. And then that's the first one. In sales, we want mavericks, captains, strategists, connectors. Those are some of the people. If you're an altruist, you're not a salesman. You're not someone who's going to sell. So we know we're not going to follow back up. You get an automatic rejection because you're not the right type of person. Just like in fantasy football, if I'm drafting a quarterback, I don't want to draft a wide receiver. It's very simple. There's a parallel there. Then we do what's called a cognitive assessment, which is based upon like, what is your ability to learn? Then if you get through those two tests, we interview you, a soft interview like over the phone. We'll then send you a sales assessment that measures like 150 different things about sales. Now, I'm in business over 11 years. I have had to find these tools. Then we send you a fourth test, which is it's a corporate test that Ian and I both use at NVR, and we've taken that and made it more specific to our type of hire because I'm a smaller business. So we've gotten very, very, very granular with tests because the human element. I think this is a huge parallel, Ian, between fantasy football. Paxton always loses because he's emotional. He hires people on his fantasy team that were great 4 or 5 years ago because he doesn't have relevant data. He's drafting Calvin Johnson, who's been retired for 5 years. But Ian and I aren't drafting him because we have better data. It's really important if you're a hiring manager that you have the right data and you're putting the right people on your team, because we're going to talk about later consequences. The consequences in fantasy football are insignificant. The consequences to a business of having the wrong people or the consequences of having to fire someone are meaningful. So it's so important to make sure that you're doing the right things and you're joining a company with integrity that's making sure you're the right hire and then has a whole system built.
So that's, we differ a little on that. I would never give someone 5 tests. I do agree with testing. I'm a fan of, behavioral testing. I'm a favor of looking for personality traits and looking against it. I guess I never called it a test, but I would call my application a test. Before I would even bother to test you, the application is a test. And, questions that I'm very big on looking at are, why did you leave each job? I'm looking to see the way you write. I'm looking to see the way you talk about former organizations.
How seriously you'll take a question like that?
Are you pointing fingers at that organization? Are you complaining about a boss in every one of your situations of why did you leave? I'm looking to see, what income you've made. And a lot of people, that's a controversial thing. But the truth is, if you've been used to making 250,000 and mine caps at 100, even if you want the job today, you won't stay. And I don't need someone who won't. You'll take it, make a few bucks, and you'll still be always looking to get back to where you were. So there are tests in the application that won't get you to the next level with me before I even have you take some kind of a test. And in some positions, we would do a second test outside of personality that was more technical. So if you said you were an underwriter that really knew VA loans, we would test you. We'd give you a little test that was very specific to that vocation. But for more generalists, I was more a fan of get data. The application tells me a lot. The resume tells me a lot. The personality indicators tell me a lot. But after that, I was more afraid of slowing the process down to analysis by paralysis, and that person wouldn't join me because they would just get tired of going through the process.
So I want to talk about that specifically, right? So we're talking about the interview arc. At NVR, at GE, everybody who's interviewing a candidate has been interviewing and trained. They've been professionally trained with follow-up training. In addition to follow-up training, they've had years of interview experience. And there's an HR person who's got years and years of experience who's going to be your first sift before it even makes it to you. In my business, I don't have people who are professionally trained. I have 2 people out of a staff of 30 that have been professionally trained on how to interview. So what we did is we found some things that would help us not make common mistakes. That's why there's more testing. So from the standpoint of being a business owner or a manager, you need to understand the system around you. And NVR is a real story. I met NVR. I had 13 job offers coming out of college, and I met NVR and I wanted to work there. I had offers from everybody else I met at the same time, and NVR hadn't even set up an interview with me yet. And I called the HR person I met and I said, look, I like it here. I'm going to contemplate starting my career there. And you guys haven't even gotten me interviewed. I've got job offers. So Ian knew that at NVR, the last thing you want to do is put more hurdles up. But as a small business, I need to put those hurdles because we're not as good. Ian, you're going to
also, I think also as a small business owner, everyone that I hire, whether they're an employee, a freelancer, a contractor, they have such a big impact on my business, and it is so painful if I get it wrong.
That's right.
So for me, it's less about testing when I go through a lot of that. It's checking references and checking real references, looking to really see real work, finding, do you know people that I know that I can call and have a long conversation with? The smaller you are, the more peculiar you are in digging into that person's background and checking to see, do they have social proof with people that I care about? Because my name is tied to whatever that person's going to do. And when you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people working for you, they have an outsized impact on your business than if you're running a Fortune 500 company where one person, do they impact the brand? 0. Not even an executive impacts the brand of a big company.
So I want to kind of pivot to something else that's absolutely in this topic, right? In fantasy football, we're going to talk about later about cutting people. In fantasy football, Ian several years ago drafted Jimmy Graham in the top 10, and he was having a crap season. And Ian cut his ass, out. What you got to realize is in fantasy football, you'll do that. In real business, you don't. So what you do is everything during the business process of interviewing is critical. Ian had talked about the way you fill out an application. So I got a job out of college at NVR, and I was doing a great job, and my managers like me. So they're like, who else do you know? I'm like, my brother. They're like, you got a brother? I'm like, yeah. They're like, have him apply. So he applies. And one of my bosses pulled me aside and he goes, yeah, the process didn't go that great with your brother. I'm like, why not? And they're like, I don't know, either he didn't want to be here or it wasn't the same. I'm like, give me an example. Under the category in the very often overlooked job application that Ian talked about, my brother wrote, last book you read. I haven't read a book since high school. And he literally wrote
10 man. I love it.
Yeah, he wrote that on a job application. So let me tell you what happened. He was never offered a job. And not only that, I look like an asshole because I recommended somebody who didn't take the application seriously. So in the business world, this is where they differ. Fantasy, you'll get cut. In the business world, you're not going to get cut. You're just never going to get a chance to get into the room if you don't take the process seriously. And I don't think I've ever told you that story.
That's hilarious. I think the next one, when you look at, we're talking about testing a little bit, but a big difference in fantasy football is you have reams of data. Football is a measurable sport, just the same as fantasy baseball. There are stats that are relatively predictive of what someone will do the next year. And even to the point where, at certain ages, certain players, running backs over 28 are probably in a decline. Receivers are more 30. Quarterbacks can go into their mid 30s before they decline. It is much harder to find good data on a person that you are going to hire. So you're often relying on what they put on their resume and what they say. It's hard to get a company to substantiate anything they've said. I know for me, the more specific someone is on their accomplishments, on their measurables, on their metrics, that tells me something about them. If someone writes, hey, at this company, I was one of the better salespeople, or they just write pretty much the job description. In this role, I was responsible for customer service and growing sales. If they just write that, that tells me they're not a person that is really that proud of anything they've accomplished, or they're hiding something. But if someone says, in this role, I was responsible for customer service rating, and I led my branch 4 straight quarters in a row with a 98.7% rating. I was also responsible for growing sales. Here's how I did it. And they go through, I was up 22%, 41%, and 30% in my 3 years working for that company, which put me in the top 5 in the company. And I received a trip, to Bermuda for it. Okay. That's hard to lie about. When someone does that, when someone gets into that level of detail, maybe they're lying, maybe, but often they're not. Often that someone that can get into that level of detail takes their numbers very serious. They're an accountable person. They're competitive. They want to tell you where they ranked, what they did, how they accomplished it. And the more specific details they give me, the more they tell me about the kind of person they are and the kind of details that they pay attention to. So for me, I got to get a lot of that on the resume and the application, the metrics of how they did. But the more specific they are, the more proud they are.
So there's a lot of stuff in there to unpack, and I loved a lot of what you said. So let's get into the difference between fantasy football and reality. Fantasy football is if Antonio Brown caught a ball or not, that can be reported, and it's cut and dry, it's black and white. A company, if you call them, they're not going to answer your questions honestly, because they're basically going to just check the box. They don't want to get into a lawsuit, or they don't want to say something disparaging about an employee. So there's almost no way for someone to substantiate it, where in the NFL, it's easier. So that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two, what you talked about a second ago, there's 2 different things here, right? Like, if you write down details and you write down all kinds of really specific things, Ian and I are good enough interviewers. We're going to hear you and we're going to ask questions about it. And as long as you're not full of shit and made it up, we're going to be impressed with that, because you are telling us detailed things that we can get our arms around. But there's a second part of it. There are people who are just as good and just as accomplished, but they can't communicate it. And what you need to realize in an interview is you must communicate it. Didn't Ben Roethlisberger throw a pass and wasn't caught? That's the metric in fantasy football. Did you go to Bermuda? Why didn't you tell me that? What did you have to do to go to Bermuda? Did you have to work extra hours? Did you have to convince someone who was a no and turn him into a yes? Those are the compelling stories that you need to convey to a manager in an interview, or you're not going to get hired. And
give me some context. Give me some context. Did you go to Bermuda because your branch won an award and you were one of 30 people and you were the lowest person on the team, but you went anyway? Or were only 7 people awarded with this out of 142 people, and they were awarded for this reason, and I had to do, give me some context on what Bermuda even means, so that I can understand, okay, what kind of a person are you? Because you can't assume. A lot of people assume that, that's their lens. They were in that company. They know what those accomplishments meant. I don't know what any of that means if I'm an interviewer, because I never worked in your company. I don't know how difficult it was to achieve what you're telling me you achieved.
Metrics in sports are the box score. That's why there's a box score. There's no box score at work. So it's your responsibility to build your own box score. Here's a story from 2000. It's not exactly recent. It's from 2002. But I was 2 contracts short to make my quota, and it was the last day of the month of July. And I had tickets to see Dave Mathews that night with all my friends. In 2002, I'm like, 27, 28? Like, Dave Mathews was it was expensive. I had good seats. I didn't want to miss it. And during the morning, I had a cancellation. So I needed to get 2 sales to get my quota. And then that morning I had a cancellation. So now I need to get 3. And what I did is I sat down and I strategized, and I went back to other people that were in my funnel. And then I called my boss and said, look, I'm not going to make my quota. I've got these 2 people that I could close, but I'm going to need your help to do this. And then I systematically went from being -1 to making my quota in 1 day. I told that story over and over and over in interviews because it was a great story with an incredible ending. And I got to go see Dave Mathews. It was an awesome story. Like, who didn't want to see Dave Mathews in 2002? Everybody. But I also took care of business. And that's a quantifiable story that your interviewer will get behind, listen to, and you can tell things, you leave like Easter eggs that they can uncover and ask you about. And that's what a good interviewer, an interviewee does. And a great interviewer will pull more of that stuff out of you.
Yeah. And the difference there is, in fantasy football, all you really care about is they scored a touchdown.
That's it.
You're not, like 90% of the points that I get from my team, I don't really see how they did it. I don't give points for creativity or, it doesn't matter to me whether it's a Barry Sanders broke 10 tackles to get to the end zone or a 2-yard plunge in. They scored a touchdown and got me 6 points. And so I'm just looking very objectively. Whereas as an interviewer, I care very much about how they got there because they might have just been on a crappy team. And even the fact that they finished 80% of quota in a year where everyone finished 40% of quota, that's impressive, right? You shined. You were still number one. You did something within the context. You could have been held back. You could have been a running back like Barry Sanders with a really bad offensive line that still rushed for a lot of yards. You might not have been number one, but pretty incredible you did it given what was up against you.
What I would say to what Ian just said there is this. In fantasy football, nobody cares about the story. In business, people absolutely care about the story, and it's up to you to bring that story up and make sure your interviewer knows it.
Yeah. And as an interviewer, find those stories. Like, and don't just get so focused on the metrics. In fantasy football, it's all about the metrics. And as an interviewer looking to hire people, dig those stories out, ask about it. If they give you some numbers, tell me about that. How'd you do versus other people? How were you able to accomplish that? Try to find a story like Frank just shared, where you came from way behind and did something incredible. Tell those stories because, whether you're on either side of the table, they stick. As an interviewer, that's the kind of person you want to hire that tells more about their character than any number that they could get. So another one that I think it goes a little bit in line, Frank, with the amount of research you do before you hire someone. In fantasy football, you never stop thinking about upgrading your team. Where in any given week, you could lose by 1 point. You can lose this week. You lost to Nilo by 1 point, 215 to 214 for $100, $100 weekly winner. But that point mattered. And it's how you put different people there. And you're very objective and you're very cutthroat about if someone is one spot ahead of another, you will drop that person and bring someone else in. And, it kind of fantasy football, if every company was run like a fantasy owner runs their team, pretty much every company would be Netflix. So Reed Hastings, he's famous for this. He is famous for cutting anyone. He pays at the very top end. He is just ruthless about finding the absolute best talent. But because he pays them so much, he is also very quick to replace them because he's paying at the very top of the market. He expects to get top of the market performance, and he's very impatient about someone not performing. And he has kind of a management test he always does with people is, if this position was open today, would I still hire this person who's doing this job? Or would I find someone else to do it? And unlike most companies that say stuff like that, Netflix will go replace him. He's replaced guys that have been with him for 20 years, vice presidents, senior vice presidents, officers in the company, just replaced them, gave him a nice package and said, need someone with a different skill set now. And it's left some bad feelings, but he's like the extreme version, like a fantasy owner. And just the same as, even though I've had Julio Jones 5 years in a row in this league, I always run out and get him. The second Julio stops scoring touchdowns, I'm dropping him and I'm finding the next thing that is out there. Now, there's pros and cons to this. One, you have to have some kind of this mentality as a manager. You have to. I started at GE. Jack Welch is famous.
I was going to ask you this. Yeah.
Famous for his for his differentiation approach, which
Right.
his differentiation approach is every year 10% have to go. And so I saw it at the tail end of Jack doing this. So imagine, when Jack Welch came into GE, it's 1980, around that time.
Jack.
And it's a big, bloated organization. It's almost like the government, just this big, slow moving tanker. So if you put something in place in 1980 at GE when there's 400,000 employees and you say the bottom 10% got to go and you can replace them, but at first he wasn't even replacing them. He was just getting rid of them. It's similar to what we've talked about before, Frank. The first layoff is always easy. I imagine the first 10 years of Jack doing this in the 80s were pretty simple and pretty profitable. You had people that have been hiding for years and no one's saying anything because the revenue gravy train was good. And it was probably easy for managers to find 10% every year to replace or never hire again. But as it got into the 90s, it got excruciating. And when I started with General Electric, which was 1999, by the time I had to do it, it was painful because we've been doing it every year. So you'd have a team of 8 people and they were all kind of getting their job done. And you got someone in HR saying, one's got to go, one's got to go. And you're like, that's just dumb. Like what? It doesn't make any sense to me. So this approach, it is always healthy at first, but when you put in rules that say you got to do it every year, to me, it loses its impact. So early, if you go in, you can almost always, if this isn't your culture, you could always find 10%. If you've not been doing it, it's easy actually, if you're kind of forced into it. In a layoff, what we just went through with COVID, a lot of people figured that out, like, oh, I could find 20 or 30, kind of embarrassed about saying it. But if you do it year after year after year, it gets harder and harder to find and replace those people. And you can lose your team a little bit also because they feel like there's no loyalty.
So there's a few things in here I want to unpack that you said, right? The first one you said is HR is coming to you and saying one has to go. That is an incredible culture that I've never lived through. As someone who's looking for a job, if you're listening to us, one of the things you should think about is that the kind of place I want to work, because that's real. And that is real pressure. And that is incredibly different than where I work and where Ian and I met, where the HR department would be like, well, can we keep them? Do we have to let them go? So think about that as you're entering a company. Like, what is the culture? What are you going to be able to get away with while you're learning? Are you going to be able to grow? Like coming in there with a flamethrower in the fantasy is really easy, because at the end of the day, nobody cares. And it was $100 or $1,000, whatever it was. And 2 years from now, you're never going to know. But if your career, you pick the wrong place where the manager and HR is like, somebody's got to go, like there's real consequences. So you need to be mindful of that. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Ian? Because I
think Frank, you're saying it right. I think the pros are, when you first start that approach, you will absolutely upgrade your team and you will find better people. And the best way to get better performance out of a team, there's no arguing this, is you find better people and you upgrade the marginal. That works on sports teams.
Yep, with everything.
That's how most sports teams turn around. They go through the draft. They bring in younger, faster, better talent. They replace people that aren't getting the job done. By far, that's the fastest, the quickest way to do it, is you just change the team a little bit. Then coaching takes place. But the problem you start to get into when you are all objective about the performance and you give no credit to the cultural aspect,
right?
You give no credit to the halo effect that a good, nice, hardworking person who cares but maybe isn't the greatest. When you give no credit to a person like that and you just ruthlessly are always cutting them out, you kind of get left with a bunch of hired assassins. You get left with a bunch of people that don't really care about the mission. They just get results and they only care about pay. And that's a difficult place to run. And I think the other thing I would add, Frank, is you have to think about as a manager. If I go cut Nick Chubb because he's limping around on a bad knee right now, the rest of my fantasy football team does not know I cut Nick Chubb. It's make-believe. It's fake. But if I go cut someone who's been with me for 5 years and has always been a good performer, but they're having a terrible 2020. They got problems at home. They got kids they got 3 kids that are doing virtual schooling. Their wife is, is stressed out all the time. They're feeling that pressure at home and they can't focus at work. And I just cut them. A long time employee. You have to think about the impact that will have on the rest of your team. Your team now is going to look at you a little different. If you fire someone who's doesn't have a good attitude, they're not a good person, they're just a bad apple to the team, or they've not performed ever.
That's the easy one.
Your team is like, hey, great job, we're better now.
That's GE in the 80s.
Yes, when you go fire someone who's a good person, loyal, like I had to fire some people that were just GE to the core. I mean, they were cheerleaders of the company. They only bought GE light bulbs and appliances. They were longtime employees that just couldn't perform the way they used to. The rest of your team looks at that sheen goes away, that loyalty of the rest of the team. And I was that way. I quickly became like, oh damn, like I'm like one of the favorite sons of GE because I'm young and I work my butt off and I'm getting results and people like me here. They're promoting me a lot. But I knew that if I had I was 2 bad quarters away from a performance plan, always at GE. Like, didn't matter how many times they promoted me, how much they paid me, didn't matter what my internal brand was. I was 2 bad quarters away from a PIP. And I knew that. And that impacted my loyalty. Once I realized that about GE, I wasn't loyal at all. I was like, whatever, as long as they keep paying me and I keep getting opportunities, I'll stay here. The second I can roll, I'll roll. There was nothing else keeping me there.
So there's a few things to talk about with this. There's discretion. There's discretion as an employee. Where will I work and where will I not work? You and I talked about this before. Richard Seymour got cut or traded. Like, the Patriots are absolutely ruthless when it comes to people. It's the reason why Tom Brady finished his career somewhere else. Is it the right move? I don't know. They make decisions better than me in that area, but that's the culture and it's ruthless. So in my business, we have over 30 employees now, and I'm 10 years into it. At COVID, we had 23, we fired 7. We came all the way down and we've grown back up. But the thing that we have here is, like, the people that we have talent wise are way better than the talent we had 5 years ago. Like, if you worked for me 5 years ago, you probably weren't qualified to work for me now. Why? We pay more. We offer benefits. We have 401k. We had none of that stuff 5 years ago. And now I can attract
You've been around long enough. There's perceived stability. It's not just Frank working out of a small office. You have a better office to show people. You can attract better talent.
Our technology is better, all of those things. But there's also an incredible team here. We had this awesome interview a few days ago. We interviewed everybody in the company because we're building a recruiting video for the company. And our service manager, he's incredible. He's been with us like 6 months. He's great. He said, at Cava, that's how we refer to the business. At Cava, it's kind of like in the military. When I was in the military, people used to tell me, I got your 6, which means you're back. He goes, I've never felt that anywhere else except the military. But at Cava, I feel like people have my 6. That means something to me. I can take a good performer and put them in a good team, a great team, and make them better. So to Ian's point, you just can't cut everybody blindly. You need to do it. But if you have a cancer, you need to get rid of it. That's Jack Welch in the 80s. So there's a balance in a 21st century company that you've got to do a little bit of both, or you're never going to be able to grow a team.
I think I'm going to add one more thing before we move on to the next piece of this. But, Frank has metrics. He measures people on certain things. He doesn't, that money comes right out of Frank's pocket. So when he pays your salary, he pays your bonus, he pays your, for your fringes, he expects a return. He doesn't do that just out of the goodness, but he's not running a charity. But if someone's metrics suffer, Frank also has the emotional intelligence to know, you know what, that person also lifts all the other boats in this office. They're a good teammate. They have that. When you talk about, do they have my 6? That person just kind of exudes the culture that I want around here. And yeah, she, her sales numbers haven't been the same as they've been in previous years. And we got to work on that. And we're talking to her about it. But damn, during a day, I see her help 15 other people. I see her run around, take on extra things. She's just a fantastic teammate. So the intangibles that aren't seen on an HR sheet, that aren't seen by an accountant in a big company that's just saying cut, cut, cut. In a company, that when you're trying to grow a culture in a company and you go cut someone like that, whose numbers are suffering, I don't care if it's a year or 2 years and they're suffering, they're not the same as they used to, but all the intangibles make everyone around them better. It has a deleting effect on the rest of the team. And I'll give an example of this. The Lions did this 2 years ago. So Golden Tate, most popular guy in our locker room. We had a 500 record right before, maybe one game over 500, but before the trade deadline. And he's expensive and he's coming up on free agency. And right in the middle of the year, they trade him to the Giants for like a 6th round pick. And he's the most popular guy in the locker room. And he's still a very good receiver. We completely fell apart after that. The Lions just fell apart after that because we made a decision on the Patriot way based on statistics and dollars per statistic, all that crap. And the whole locker room just quit on the coaching team. They were like, well, you quit on us, we quit on you. No one stopped. Everyone saw that Golden Tate's receptions were down and his average yards per carry were down. That was all fair. No one stopped to think about the impact that guy had on the other 50 people in the locker room, the way he dove for balls, the way he fought, the way he picked up other teammates, the little coaching he did in practice. And it just destroyed the team because everyone put they put decisions based on metrics and numbers and not on a holistic view of the impact they made on the organization.
And there's a bunch of sports examples of taking a great player who's an asshole and getting rid of them, and the team gets better. And that's the same thing in a small business like mine. We had somebody that wasn't pulling their weight and everybody knew it, but they were in a position where we just couldn't get rid of them at the time because we didn't have someone else in place. And then when we finally got rid of them, everyone said, thank God you did that. Like, that was long overdue. And I would justify it, say, well, we couldn't do it. No, they're like, no. We understand why it lasted. But that's the kind of stuff that, like, those things mean. It's very hard to quantify, but there is real meaning and there is real value with the people who work in your company.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think we can move on to the next piece, which I love. And it's advice that's often given to people. But we can talk about when it makes sense and when it doesn't. But fantasy football does not pay that well. Frank says it's a big money league, but I'm not missing a mortgage payment over this. I'm not making a mortgage payment over this. It's much more about pride. There's money on the line, but it's about pride. But the amount of hours we put in for something that pays this little is really quite ridiculous. It's quite silly. This morning at 5 a.m, I'm checking to see what everyone picked up on waivers, and I'm putting in extra waivers myself and trying to set my lineup at 5 a.m. Like, I'm up stressing out about whether Frank picked up this defense that I wanted to get and checking it. And it's because it's fun. It's something that whether we had money on it or not, we would all do it. And I think that aspirationally, I'm certainly in this place, and I know you are. I don't do anything right now business-wise that isn't fun. I spent 20 years doing what I had to do. I didn't consider selling variable speed controls on motors and paper mills. I didn't consider that to be terribly exciting, and I sure as hell would not have done it if it would have not paid me. And it's the same with mortgages. I never found the mortgage business interesting or exciting. I didn't really find home building terribly exciting. I enjoyed my time with both teams and both companies, but I made money. I had to do what I had to do to make money to then be able to do whatever the hell I wanted to do. But today, I do whatever I want to do, and I find that I'm much harder working when I kind of go down paths that seem like fun to me than go down paths that seem profitable to me. And I think in the long term, you can have both. If you're very excited about something, if you're passionate about it, if you're having fun, you'll perform better and you'll get paid better. And I've found that the more fun I've had in my career, the more money I've made. And fantasy, I don't know that fun translates to money, but certainly I have no problem putting in a lot of time because it's a blast. And what the hell, like life is short, so why not spend your time on things that are fun?
So I'm gonna talk about three things here. First, last night it's waivers is today in our league, right? I'm like, should I pick up a book? Should I go get the newspaper? What should I do? My wife sits next to me and she reads an entire section of the paper, not an insignificant amount of time, while I just scroll through fantasy. So it's like, all right, time to go to bed. I walk upstairs. She's read the paper. I screwed around in fantasy, but I felt fabulous the entire time I did it. All right, second, Ian's reached a place in his life where many people never get. I'm not there. I can't do exactly what I want. I picked a different path. I probably could if I just nuke this thing now, but I don't want to do that. But getting to where you are at and you're in your business and you can kind of in your life and you get to make those decisions. I watched him for 2 decades. When he had kids, he was getting up at 3 a.m. He was making incredible sacrifices. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was getting up early so he could read, he could work out, and he could start his workday at like 5:30, which no one does that. Like Starbucks wasn't even open. He's driving into the office because he wanted to get ahead and he knew he was in a capitalistic part of his life and he wanted to get that work done before he had to coach baseball or could coach baseball and didn't want to miss it. Anything you want to weigh in on that, Ian? Because I mean, that's remarkable.
No, that's accurate. And there's nothing worse than being in the office without Starbucks and then having to leave the office at 6 to go get your Starbucks. So I will add that.
So many of you know this about me. I'm a paid consultant for businesses like mine, right? And most of them are smaller, but people always ask me, like, when do I scale? When do I grow? When do I hire? And I use something that Ian just said a second ago. When it's work and it's not fun, it's time to hire. So if you're a small business owner and you have a couple of employees, think about those first couple of hires. For me, it was accounting. There's two reasons I hired an accountant first. It's three. It's critical. I suck at it and it was miserable. I always did it last. It was the last thing I did because I wasn't good at it and it was awful, but it's critical in the business. So start thinking about those things. And if you build a business, think about areas where you have a good time. You're really good at it usually if you have a good time. Ian's an incredible writer. He didn't know he was going to be an incredible writer, but he has fun doing it. And those two things go hand in hand. My accountant is so different than me. Like we get into joking arguments all the time about like how I do things versus how she does things. I hate accounting. She loves it. She's incredible at it. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean someone else won't find that to be their dream job. So understand those things. If you don't have fun with it, find someone who will have fun with it and give it to them because you will feel better. You will do a better job and your company will be better because that person is in their area of genius and they're doing a great job.
Love that. I love everything that you just said on that. So I think the last thing that we talked about, Frank, is, and I think this is the difference between a good company and a bad company. A good company has a mission, knows what it wants to do, and is trying to solve a problem for a subset of customers. And they are just relentless about listening to those customers and iterating their process, their product, and focused on serving that area. And a bad company is overly focused on what their competitors are doing. All they do is think about, agonize, chase, follow. It's the reason why Coca-Cola switched their product to New Coke in the 80s because Pepsi took a little bit of market share with their little taste test and they freaked out and they chased them. And you know, that situation, so many more companies do that kind of stuff than you would think. And in fantasy, I spend way too much time focusing on Frank's team when I'm playing Frank that week and watching Frank's players and trying to see what moves he's making. And in the real world, a manager would never do that. You just don't give a damn about what your competition is doing, because in fantasy, there's a scarcity mindset and there's only so many players you can pick and there's only so many games you can play. But in business, your competitors can all be kicking ass and so can you. It doesn't really matter. just because one is doing well doesn't mean that they're taking it from you.
Yeah. I mean, where do you want me to go with that? Because I agree with everything you said.
He's not the best color man in the business, folks.
For nothing, folks. I mean, I think what you want me to say there is, I agree with you. Like when we think about competitors in my business, it almost comes off as arrogant because people are like, who are your competitors? I'm like, oh, we don't really have any. Maybe we have some, but they're all real small and it doesn't really matter. Like it doesn't matter to me who my competitors are. Like, are we doing better? Are we doing what we need to do? Are we capitalizing? What are our metrics based upon our spend? How are all those things kind of unfolding? Like we spend so much more time just myopically looking at us than we do anybody else. And use examples of that. Like Bill Gates is a great example, right? Richest man in the world, been the richest man in the world, in the history of the world for years. All he did in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s was Microsoft. That was it. Now he does something completely altruistic, but he was not that way. He was fierce. He'd slice you up for a percentage of the market during that period of time. But now that he's so rich and he's kind of taken his eye off the ball, he's thought of something different. So that's, I think, what's so different about this. Like, I do give a shit about what defense Ian has. I don't care one bit about what my competitors are doing unless it's revolutionary, unless they're doing something we haven't thought of that's changing the market. And that's why I'm in a mastermind group, because I'll hear big trends. But locally, I don't pay attention to it because I got to focus on us and getting better in metrics.
Yeah, taking it back to fantasy again, I'll go pick someone up on waivers knowing Frank needs them and knowing I might not even use them. I'm just trying to block him. I'm just trying to keep him from getting a little bit better. And I don't think most good companies do things like that. I don't take NVR. We rarely went and did a deal because we didn't want someone else to do a deal. We either did the deal because it made financial sense or we didn't do the deal. It wasn't, let's do this because if we don't, Toll Brothers will do it. There was never that kind of a conversation going on at NVR. It was either what's best for NVR, not what can hurt a competitor.
So I think this mindset about doing something because you're blocking someone else happens on two extreme ends of the spectrum. I think if you're really, really small and you can't see the forest for the trees, you think this way because you're just not big enough yet. And I see that in my business this way. I often say that people in our business lack the class gene. We have a low barrier of entry business. A lot of people, all they've done is taken a class or watched some stuff on YouTube and they enter the business, but they don't have any money. So they make bad decisions because they're chasing the dollar. And it in a lot of instances, it results in, like, it just seems like there's bad ethics, but that's on the lower end of the scale. If you look at like what Amazon does things because they want to block others, but they have a goal to take over the world. So on the really small side and on the really big side, I think it happens. But with most normal businesses, if you take those kind of swings, if you swing for the lower tier stuff, you're going to be in the dirt or in the mud where you don't want to be. And if you take a big swing on the other side, Amazon has more money than all of us combined. So if you take a big swing up, you could go broke. So you have to kind of understand. And I think Ian, what he said is there's a strategy move. Like he'll get that fourth receiver because next week I need him. Well, we can do that in fantasy. There's no consequence. Worst case, you lose a couple bucks. But in business, you can't do that because you could hurt yourself.
And think about when a company gets as big as Amazon or Google, where they're spending money on blocking other people. Are they really that exciting of a company to work for anymore? Right? You've gotten so big where that's how you're spending your time. They were way more exciting companies when they didn't give a damn what Toys R Us was doing or Barnes and Noble was doing. Amazon was just putting all their money and focus into growing. That was the time to own Amazon. Maybe it's still a good time to own it now, but not like it was 15 years ago when they were putting all their time into themselves and their customers and their focus. Now that they've grown to a size where they're just blocking people, Facebook, all of them, they're not as exciting as they were when they were in their early phases. And all they did was focus on customers and serving a niche.
it's kind of like we talked about earlier with Neutron Jack. There's going to come a place where a place in time where Amazon becomes bloated, and they're closer to bloated than they are closer to exponential growth. Like for a $3,000 stock value, there's no way you're going up 15 times in a short period of time, like you could from a couple $100 to $1,000. So like that's it. And I think you have to understand, like the goal here was to talk about business, but do it in a way that was fun for us and for you to listen to, hopefully. But we're talking about fantasy sports and doing like you're not going to be in those spots. Like, and you got to just pick the right thing. Where do you invest? Where do you put your time? Where do you put your career? Like, would I rather work a couple extra hours or coach T-ball? Like, that's the kind of stuff we're trying to talk about here is, where do you focus and what do you pick?
Yeah. Nilo can go pick up Tua to keep you from having him as a keeper next year. I would never go hire someone's sales rep and put him on a bench for a year, just not having anything for them to do, just to hurt like that kind of thinking doesn't work. That just it doesn't work.
So you and I have both read the book Titan, right? It's about Rockefeller. Rockefeller did shit like that. Absolutely. But it was 100 years ago. It was a different world.
And when was he doing it? He was doing it once he was big, once he was a Titan. He didn't do it to become a Titan.
That's right.
When he was becoming a Titan, he was opportunistic, grabbing things, being creative. Once he was a Titan, then he went and bought the railroads to shut down certain, he did things to block people.
And it also was a different time. So there is certain strategy if you do get to a certain point. But most of us are like, I probably will never get there, and I have a pretty successful thing. You got to understand where that stuff kind of comes down.
If you get to a place where you have to worry about monopoly law, you've done a good job. I salute you, and I invite you on the I Need to Speak to a Manager podcast, because we'd like to have you.
Yes.
For everyone else,
we'll get a third.
Worry about Rockefeller's tactics.
We'll get a third box. You are welcome to join us.
The odds of someone worrying about monopoly law being on our podcast and listening are not high. Not high.
Slim.
For all the aspiring Rockefellers, though, you have an open invitation to come on and talk.
For sure. And for Nilo, who out of solidarity is going to listen, we love you, buddy.
We do. And that pesky monopoly law. All right, Frankie. Well, hey, good luck. Who do you play this week in fantasy? Me?
You.
Me? Tide is changing. I got some stuff for you now. Yeah. You just shared way too much about your strategy today on this call.
It's funny. I learned some things about you as well.
See you, homie.
All right, brother.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.